US President Donald Trump has just addressed the World Economic Forum in Switzerland's Davos and delivered an America First speech. Along with his America is open to business speech, US President also addressed issues of terrorism and free and fair trade. A highly anticipated closing session at the World Economic Forum. Listen in.
Thank you, Klaus, very much. It's a privilege to be here at this forum where leaders in business, science, art, diplomacy, and world affairs have gathered for many, many years to discuss how we can advance prosperity, security, and peace. I'm here today to represent the interests of the American people and to affirm America's friendship and partnership in building a better world. Like all nations represented at this great forum, America hopes for a future in which everyone can prosper and every child can grow up free from violence, poverty, and fear. Over the past year, we have made extraordinary strides in the U.S. We're lifting up forgotten communities, creating exciting new opportunities, and helping every American find their path to the American dream, the dream of a great job, a safe home, and a better life for their children. After years of stagnation, the United States is once again experiencing strong economic growth. The stock market is smashing one record after another and has added more than $7 trillion in new wealth since my election. Consumer confidence, business confidence, and manufacturing confidence are the highest they have been in many decades. Since my election, we've created 2.4 million jobs, and that number is going up very, very substantially. Small business optimism is at an all-time high. New unemployment claims are near the lowest we've seen in almost half a century. African American unemployment has reached the lowest rate ever recorded in the United States, and so has unemployment among Hispanic Americans. The world is witnessing the resurgence of a strong and prosperous America. I'm here to deliver a simple message. There has never been a better time to hire, to build, to invest, and to grow in the United States. America is open for business, and we are competitive once again. The American economy is by far the largest in the world, and we've just enacted the most significant tax cuts and reform in American history. We've massively cut taxes for the middle class and small businesses to let working families keep more of their hard-earned money. We lowered our corporate tax rate from 35% all the way down to 21%. As a result, millions of workers have received tax cut bonuses from their employers in amounts as large as $3,000. The tax cut bill is expected to raise the average American's household income by more than $4,000. The world's largest company, Apple, announced it plans to bring $245 billion in overseas profits home to America. Their total investment into the United States economy will be more than $350 billion over the next 5 years. Now is the perfect time to bring your business, your jobs, and your investments to the United States. This is especially true because we have undertaken the most extensive regulatory reduction ever conceived. Regulation is stealth taxation. The U.S., like many other countries, unelected bureaucrats, and we have, believe me, we have them all over the place, and they've imposed crushing and anti-business and anti-worker regulations on our citizens with no vote, no legislative debate, and no real accountability. In America, those days are over. I pledged to eliminate 2 unnecessary regulations for every 1 new regulation. We have succeeded beyond our highest expectations. Instead of 2 for 1, we have cut 22 burdensome regulations for every 1 new rule. We are freeing our businesses and workers so they can thrive and flourish as never before. We are creating an environment that attracts capital, invites investment, and rewards production. America is the place to do business. So come to America, where you can innovate, create, and build. I believe in America. As President of the United States, I will always put America first, just like the leaders of other countries should put their country first also. But America first does not mean America alone. When the United States grows, so does the world. American prosperity has created countless jobs all around the globe, and the drive for excellence, creativity, and innovation in the U.S. has led to important discoveries that help people everywhere live more prosperous and far healthier lives. As the United States pursues domestic reforms to unleash jobs and growth, we are also working to reform the international trading system so that it promotes broadly shared prosperity and rewards to those who play by the rules. We cannot have free and open trade if some countries exploit the system at the expense of others. We support free trade, but it needs to be fair and it needs to be reciprocal, because in the end, unfair trade undermines us all. The United States will no longer turn a blind eye to unfair economic practices, including massive intellectual property theft, industrial subsidies, and pervasive state-led economic planning. These and other predatory behaviors are distorting the global markets and harming businesses and workers, not just in the U.S., but around the globe. Just like we expect the leaders of other countries to protect their interests, as President of the United States, I will always protect the interests of our country, our companies, and our workers. We will enforce our trade laws and restore integrity to our trading system. Only by insisting on fair and reciprocal trade can we create a system that works not just for the U.S., but for all nations. As I have said, the United States is prepared to negotiate mutually beneficial bilateral trade agreements with all countries. This will include the countries in TPP, which are very important. We have agreements with several of them already. We would consider negotiating with the rest, either individually or perhaps as a group, if it is in the interests of all. My administration is also taking swift action in other ways to restore American confidence and independence. We are lifting self-imposed restrictions on energy production to provide affordable power to our citizens and businesses and to promote energy security for our friends all around the world. No country should be held hostage to a single provider of energy. America is roaring back, and now is the time to invest in the future of America. We have dramatically cut taxes to make America competitive. We are eliminating burdensome regulations at a record pace. We are reforming the bureaucracy to make it lean, responsive, and accountable, and we are ensuring our laws are enforced fairly. We have the best colleges and universities in the world, and we have the best workers in the world. Energy is abundant and affordable. There has never been a better time to do business in America. We are also making historic investments in the American military because we cannot have prosperity without security. To make the world safer from rogue regimes, terrorism, and revisionist powers, we are asking our friends and allies to invest in their own defenses and to meet their financial obligations. Our common security requires everyone to contribute their fair share. My administration is proud to have led historic efforts at the United Nations Security Council and all around the world to unite all civilized nations in our campaign of maximum pressure to denuke the Korean Peninsula. We continue to call on partners to confront Iran's support for terrorists and block Iran's path to a nuclear weapon. We're also working with allies and partners to destroy jihadist terrorist organizations such as ISIS, and very successfully so.
Want to go across to Managing Editor Business Today, Rajiv Dubey, joining us live from Davos. Rajiv, highly anticipated speech by US President Donald Trump. He dwelt on many of the issues that he was expected to. What do you think were the big takeaways? Because one of the most significant things he said, which will be interpreted perhaps as a bit of a softening of stance, was America first doesn't mean America alone, Rajiv.
Before the speech started, people in the hall had been saying that it's going to be a summarizing of his America First policy. And that's precisely what it turned out.
Summarizing of his America First policy. And that's precisely what it turned out to be. Essentially, what he was essentially addressing his domestic audience, partly international audience, inviting them to come and invest, but only on America First terms. He did talk about some geostrategic issues such as denuking the Korean Peninsula and the Iran denuclearization, as well as dealing with ISIS. But essentially, this whole thing was a strong elaboration of his America First policy, where he said that the tax rates that he has cut has led to American people getting more into their hands as far as the, AT&T, some of the other companies have started giving bonuses of up to $3,000.
Yes.
Then he talked about how 2.4 million new jobs have been created ever since he came to power. And also how the stock market has seen 84 new highs since he's come to power, and that it has added something like $7 trillion to the American economy. So it was largely for the American audience, and he's also asked anybody who wants to come and invest in America must come and invest, but it has to be, free trade will have to be done on a reciprocal basis, that IP theft will not be tolerated, that subsidies by other countries will not be tolerated, and that predatory behavior will not be tolerated by America. So those were some of the highlights that are from this speech.
Any big, specific takeaways as far as an Indian audience is concerned? Because we know that in the Indian business community, visa holders, those looking for work in America, hang on to every word that this president says, Rajiv. Yes. So what would be the big highlights? What would be the specific takeaways for them?
Yes, Shiv. So, from the Indian point of view, he reiterated the American stand on immigration system. He said that the American immigration system is stuck in the past, and that it has been basically built around family systems, that one person from the family comes in, then another person from the family comes in, another person from the family comes in. He is essentially saying that it has to move to a merit-based system, and this is a reiteration of his stance on American immigration system, saying that anybody who wants to come into America must come on a merit-based basis rather than family basis.
Okay, absolutely. So significant takeaways for the Indian business and work community. Rajiv, thanks very much for joining us. Also want to bring in India Today's managing editor Rahul Kanwal, who's been fronting our coverage in Davos all of this week. Rahul, highly anticipated closing speech by the US president. You were there as well. Take us through what you thought were the big takeaways.
So let me take you through some of the reactions we are getting to American President Donald Trump's first address at the World Economic Forum. In the end, a rather tame affair. There were some guffaws, some smirks, a lot of snide remarks, but the president kept to script.
The president has a style, you know. He likes to instigate and he likes to promote. But one thing I must confess today, that America first was very lucid. I think the message that America is rank one in its priority and the American pride in business and confidence and conviction has come back. That was a very strong message. And, you know, there is also enough measurement criteria now in place. Secondly, the job factor, which is extremely crucial in any monetary policy setting in the United States of America. That, I think, was a very good message as well, that the jobs are coming even to the less privileged, you know, the Hispanics and, you know, the black Americans. So I think the fact is that today's speech was, in my judgment, post his election, the best.
Really? He also said America first doesn't mean America alone. Tried to sound a note of conciliation. He was very keen on checking out the responses from the audience that was listening to him, Mr. Kapoor.
No, Rahul, I quite agree with you that it's not about America first only or America alone. But the fact is that he's now realizing that in global eminence, America has to regain its stature. After all, it's a $20+ trillion economy. And even a little needle movement, as has happened more recently, can make a very big shift in the global economy. So I think job creation, his focus agenda as a businessman is very intact on global business and trade growth, investment growth. I think he likes India. He didn't say so in his speech, but I think he alluded that he's had some very good interactions. But the fact of the matter is that today we have to take pride that the American president has got his act together.
Right, thank you very much, Mr. Rana Kapoor, for joining us in India today. In fact, yesterday, Shiv, at the reception which was hosted in honor of Donald Trump, he spoke of my friend Modi at least a few times. He also said something which was rather astonishing. He said India is growing at 9%. And given that India is growing at 9%, can we take your reaction to the address by Mr. Trump? Okay, so he said that India is growing at 9%, and if India can grow at 9%, why can't America grow at 5 and 6%? There were a couple of senior industrialists who were sitting there, and they were wondering where the American president is getting this data from, because India hasn't been growing at 9%. But anyway, that's what he said when he was speaking at the address. This rather underwhelming, actually, Shiv, because there were lots. You know, where I was, I must tell you, the moment he came in, people started laughing. They looked at him, they started laughing. He had his eyes darting around. People were looking at him and wondering what he's going to say. There's a lot of snide comments, lots of laughter, but I must also say a lot of hypocrisy. For the amount of fun all these fancy delegates at the World Economic Forum make of Donald Trump, there was huge interest in listening to what he had to say. This queue going in went on for hours. Yeah, so I just want to go across to Arun Puri, Editor-in-Chief of India Today. You just heard Donald Trump speak. What did you make of this, Mr. Puri?
Well, the band was good.
What about the bandmaster?
Well, I thought it was a bit of a hum-ho speech, kind of very transactional, what we expected, predictable. Actually, he should have taken a bit of Modi's speech in, which was far more far-reaching in its global perspective. And maybe Prime Minister Modi should have taken some of his speech, which would have brought India more into focus rather than the global. So it was a predictable speech. But I want to say something about Trump, is that the press before the elections didn't take him seriously. They took him literally. And his supporters took him not literally, but seriously. And maybe we should have taken him literally and seriously, because he's done everything what he promised he would do. And I think the tax reform bit has gone down so well with this Davos crowd that they're actually quite happy with Mr. Trump.
And one of the things that's often said about leaders here is that speak about macro world trends, don't try and be a salesman for what you're doing in your own country. But that's exactly what Trump did. He came and tom-tommed his achievements and tried to tell the World Economic Forum about everything that he'd done since he came into power.
Yes, I thought that people expect here for the US to take a more global leadership role, and that's not happened. And that, I think, is a is a disappointment, because America withdrawing from a global leadership role leaves a huge vacuum, and that's a question of worry for everybody who's interested in international stability.
And what did you make of the huge crowds waiting for hours trying to come in? Given the amount of fun they make of Donald Trump, there was a lot of interest in listening to what he had to say.
I'm sorry.
I think it's curiosity, a lot of curiosity to see him in person. So much has been written about him and so much has been talked about him. So the curiosity of seeing him, and him being, when he was off the script, he was quite entertaining in terms of the way he talked about his team and what a great job he's doing. He's a self-promoter. He's a salesman for himself and a salesman for his country. That's Donald Trump.
And he's been very successful at that. Thank you very much, Mr. Puri, for joining us. I want to tell you, Shiv, that when I was going in, and that's just when the music band was coming out on the stage, so there was lots of laughter, lots of smirks around. And the usher on the way in, rather cheeky usher, this young boy, he said, well, I hope you've got your popcorn, the show's about to begin, hurry up, grab your seat. So there's a lot of humor, but the speech in contrast though, Shiv, was rather tame by Donald Trump standards. No doubt about it, he stuck to the script. People were expecting that he may come and start dissing the World Economic Forum. He did nothing of the sort. So in many senses, he's actually been more statesman-like than many would have expected. You know, when people came at the last moment, a lot of American media wondering whether he'd show up at all. If he shows up, what would he say? So he came, he said what he had to, and actually did reasonably well in what he said. Shiv.
Rahul, what happened to, there was that air of, probable protest. There were apparently banners outside as well. We thought, there may be some kind of stunts pulled inside the auditorium as well. You saw those lines outside. Did nothing happen at all? I mean, ultimately, there were no protests or anything of the sort inside?
No, so Shiv, we know for a fact that lots of people have been trying to come in and protest. There were talks of how seats would be turned and there'd be silent protests. So far, we haven't seen anything of that sort. Remember, it's a big auditorium where we were, and lots of people inside that auditorium. So if somebody did something, they did it very silently. They didn't necessarily create a big song and dance about it. But it was interesting. Everybody came, listened. People are going back with a sense of relief. I think relief is palpable that he didn't embarrass America on the world stage. He didn't come out and start trashing the World Economic Forum. He came out, stuck to the script, which for a president like Donald Trump by itself is a very big deal. What we want to do now for our viewers is get you an exclusive conversation that India Today editor-in-chief Arun Puri and I had with Fareed Zakaria, one of the world's leading strategic thinkers. We caught up with him at the World Economic Forum between the time he interviewed the King of Jordan and just before he interviewed the Prime Minister of Israel. Here is one of the world's leading thinkers, Fareed Zakaria, in an exclusive conversation with India Today. At the World Economic Forum Congress, we're now in conversation with one of the world's leading strategic thinkers, Fareed Zakaria. Welcome. Also with me is India Today Group's editor-in-chief, Arun Puri. Mr. Puri.
Fareed, you're a renowned international expert. A lot of changes are happening in the world. This whole power matrix in the world is changing. The America first, China assertive or aggressive, whichever way you look at it. Russia playing its own game. And India, of course, trying to now make a claim for some kind of global presence. How do you give us a wrap on how do you see these changing power equations in the world?
It's very interesting, Arun. Right now it feels like we're in a period where there's a great disjuncture between the economics and the politics. So economically, we are in a period of synchronous global growth. Every major part of the world is growing. This has not happened for decades. I mean, even when you think back to the 03, 04, 05, 06 period, remember Japan was not growing. That's 10-15% of the world economy. Now everyone is growing. India, China, the United States, Europe. Japan has had 6 quarters of successive growth. So the conditions seem fairly benign in terms of investment. Stocks are up, bonds are up, commercial real estate is up, residential real estate. I mean, I'm talking globally now. I know there are pockets here and there. And yet, there is a great deal of unease because of precisely what you put your finger on, I think. There's a sense that underneath this benign economic reality is a shifting geopolitical reality. The United States is retreating in some ways. Europe remains inactive. China is asserting itself, but as you say, other powers It's not just Russia, it's Saudi Arabia. The Middle East has essentially become a place, for example, where Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia are playing a complicated game with the United States more in a supportive role than before. What does all this mean as China starts asserting itself? And I think that things haven't settled yet. It's a period of great flux, but there's a great deal of uneasiness as to whether, when will the other shoe drop? And in this context, I don't get the sense that India has figured out its game. I think that China has figured out its game. I think Russia has figured out its game. But with India, you kind of have this feeling of wanting a role without knowing really what that is, what is the strategy, what is the purpose. And you saw that in a way in Prime Minister Modi's speech, which was fine. I mean, he said good things, but it lacked a kind of single strategic message. And I think that that's because we don't have a single strategy.
Is that related to the lack of economic clout? Is there a connection between, people listen to China because of the size of its economy and the role it plays in terms of world economy. Is the lack of economic clout one of the reasons why we can't really have a strong role globally? No, I think it's not. I think honestly, of course, you get a bigger voice and more respect if you have 10, 20, 15% of the global GDP. And so certainly one thing India should do is to focus on that. So China did that. China focused on its economy and development and was very quiet on foreign policy. Actually subcontracted foreign policy to America. Said whatever the Americans do is fine with us. We are just developing. The Russians take a very different approach. They take what power they have and try to punch above their weight by saying we're going to have ideas, we're going to have influence, we're going to engage. And it's not so much that I think that India needs to do one or the other, but I think India doesn't know which it wants. Some days it seems as though India wants to be a global player. Some days it seems that it just wants to focus on development. And I think that the more important issue is that India has to decide, in this context of the world you very correctly described, what power balance and what power configuration best serves India's interests? What should India be pushing for? What trends? The rise of China is the fundamental fact in geopolitics in the world today. What is India's response to it? I find it very difficult to find. Indian officials almost don't want to think about the problem rather than to provide an answer. Okay, two questions. What should be India's role? And secondly, what is America's view on, or Trump's view on China? It seems to be ambiguous. Sometimes it's, they're the worst people on earth, and sometimes it's, okay, we're friends and so forth. So is there a great deal of ambiguity between America and China? And, it affects many other things like North Korea and so forth. Give us a clarity on that. And then what would you think that India's role should be in today's context? So I think you're absolutely right about Trump with China. It's ambiguous. On the campaign trail, he excoriated China. He pilloried China. China was the country that was raping America, taking its jobs, taking its factories. Since he's come into office, I think two or three things have changed that. One is he's realized that America and China are deeply interdependent. The Chinese economy and the American economy depend on each other. They're two largest trading nations in the world. I think he's also realized the Chinese play hardball. The Chinese are tough. He tried to play an opening gambit where he said, maybe I'll recognize Taiwan. The Chinese shut that down, essentially froze all contact with the United States, and he caved, honestly. The great, tough Donald Trump essentially caved on that. So part of it is that. I will be honest, I think he's also aware that the Chinese overseas money is very large and potent, and he's a real estate developer. There's a lot of Chinese money in the real estate world. I wonder whether he's thinking about his post-presidency, but for whatever reason, he has become much more moderate on China. I think that what India has to recognize is that the rise of China is a fundamental fact. China is now in a different league than India. Indian friends of mine, Kamal Nath used to say this, India will overtake China because China is going to grow old before it grows rich. This is all nonsense. The Chinese economy is now 4 times the size of the Indian economy, and it's basically still growing about the same pace. Indians are supposed to be good at math. There's no way you can. India is going to be in a subordinate economic position. So it has to ask itself, does it want to be in a subordinate geopolitical position? If not, it needs allies. It needs to have a more assertive Asian diplomacy.
but it also needs to think about, rethink its relationship with the United States. So far, the US-India relations for the last 20 years have been the United States making overtures to India, and India still playing the role of the reluctant bride, still harboring some kind of neo-colonial, third world ideas, until the point where George Bush essentially handed India the nuclear deal on a platter and said, here's everything you could possibly ask for. And even then, as you know, it was very difficult. I think the Indians have to become active. Indians have to recognize that they need to take control of their future, and they have to chart a course much more actively in Asia and much more actively in the world, because otherwise Asia will be shaped by China's dominance. It doesn't mean it will be malign. I mean, I think China is a very responsible country, but it will not always reflect India's interests, values, and priorities. And if India doesn't do that, if India doesn't take the role now, it will find itself, being the rule taker rather than the rule maker in the new emerging global order.
But do you agree that Prime Minister Modi has moved the needle with America? And as he's had a good relationship with Obama, now apparently with Trump too. Have we become closer and far more dependent? And it's not only seen through the prism of Pakistan, that what is the relation between America and Pakistan. Now it seems to be an independent bilateral relationship.
I think that Prime Minister Modi is a very good diplomat. He's very good at building these ties personally. He's very good at saying the right things, then delivering on them. I think I give him very high marks for all that. But I don't think there still is a strategic shift that has taken place, so that you still have an India that remains much less active on the world stage than it should be. If you look per capita at the number of diplomats India has compared to China, per capita, I think India has a quarter or a fifth as many. So you need a much more assertive diplomatic push. You need to figure out ways in which the United States and India can do things more jointly. Look, this is an obvious alliance. World's oldest democracy, world's largest democracy. India should become, in a way, in Asia, what Britain was in Europe for the United States.
We should be more aggressive.
Yeah, and I think there should be this kind of long-term strategy. Where do we want to be 20 years from now? Where do we want to be? And I think that part of what makes that difficult is India doesn't like the idea of being dependent on a ultimately larger and more powerful U.S., but the choice is you're either that or you're dependent on a larger and more powerful China.
You're going to be interviewing Prime Minister from Israel, Netanyahu, and we've recently had his visit in India. You must have seen all the lovely hugs and warmth which was there. And India voted against this move to Jerusalem. How do you see this relationship developing, and in the context of what is happening in the Middle East? Where should India be? I mean, are we doing the right thing here?
Yes, I think that Prime Minister Modi here has been, he has his own reasons for doing it, as we know, and some of them are internal to India's divisions and communal issues. But fundamentally, I think India should be trying to maintain good relations with both the Arabs and Israel and the Israelis. Israel is an increasingly important country, particularly in the world of technology. There's no reason India should not take advantage of that and try to build a productive relationship. It should realize that it is to Israel's enormous advantage to have that relationship with India, and so it should be a relationship done properly and on equal terms. But again, as I say, with Prime Minister Modi on these kinds of issues, I think he's smart. He thinks it through. These things are executed well. And I think that the challenge will always be how do you maintain that balance? And even America has usually maintained that balance under the Trump administration. They've gone too much in one side, or not enough on the other, and they're losing, in a way, Arab goodwill. I don't think India needs to do that. But clearly having good relations with Israel is a win-win for India and Israel.
So Prime Minister Modi has done great diplomacy all over the world, or from America to Japan and China and so forth. But he hasn't seemed to be able to deal with our neighbor, Pakistan. What are your views on that? How can we move that forward? Right, because...
So I think the fundamental problem with Indo-Pakistani relations, one has to remember, is Pakistan. By which I mean to say that Pakistani state as it has developed over the last 30 years, certainly since Zia, is a state that has tied to it almost now in its DNA a certain support for militants that has been a very good asymmetrical strategy to keep India on the defense, or supposedly a good asymmetrical strategy. That means it's very hard to to break that link, and it makes it hard to normalize relations, and I use normalize just in a generic sense. So one has to hope that that link is broken in Pakistan. There are some indications that that's happening. With that said, I think that Prime Minister Modi has the capacity to do something bold with Pakistan, which he has not done. He has the capacity to do what Nixon did when he went to China. If you remember, Nixon could go to communist China and make a deal because he was the arch-communist. He was the arch-anti-communist. He was the most right-wing politician who had always been so anti-communist that nobody would question his credentials.
Same with Russia, with Gorbachev and Reagan.
Exactly. With Reagan doing the same thing with Gorbachev. So if Modi tried to do something on Pakistan, nobody is going to attack him for being soft. And it would be a chance to really transform that relationship. And by the way, transform the subcontinent. People forget, Pakistan is, it's a very large country. Pakistani businesses are very good. If India and Pakistan were to trade together rather than importing things from thousands of miles away, it would be a big win-win. It would be, I've seen some analyses that say it could add 0.5 point of GDP growth to India if you had genuine, almost, kind of EU-like trade. In a way, the goal for South Asia surely should be that these countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, become a little bit more like the European Union. This is one culture, one civilization. If they would all trade together, you would have standards of living would rise, innovation would happen, and these conflicts would go away, because these conflicts are largely invented. As I say, all of us who live outside know you meet these people and they all seem the same.
The big gorilla in this room is the Pakistan army, in terms of the fact that when you may make a deal with the civilian government, somehow or the other it gets stuck when they go back to Pakistan. What is the way to deal with this? Should you bring the Pakistani army on the table and say, all right, we'll deal with you and the civilian government and break this deadlock? Or is that something diplomatically cannot be done? You know a lot of, about diplomacy.
It could be done. The Pakistani army is so nakedly in power. I don't think that they would have a problem with negotiating. The reason they don't is they play this very clever game where this absolves them of the responsibility, so that they can exercise control from behind the scenes. The one golden opportunity we had that existed, however, unfortunately, was when Musharraf was, in a sense, had literally fused civilian and military authority. If that deal had gone through, perhaps something could have changed. Now one has to work, because you will find
this dilemma of should an Indian government deal with a
civilian government,
a dictator, right, on one side, who's had a coup and has become a dictator then, or should we be having to deal with the army? Is that from a diplomatic point of view, is like, do you deal with a terrorist or not?
Yeah. I don't worry about the niceties of dealing with the dictator. Look, he's running the country as long as you can make a deal. The problem now is you won't be able to deal directly with the army. The civilian government will say you have to deal with us. So as you say, you engage with them, but that government doesn't have the authority to make a deal that they know will be rejected by the army. And because of that division of authority, it becomes impossible to kind of close the deal. All that said, let's come back to the bottom line. If anyone can do it on the Indian side, it's Modi. And so what would he lose if he were to say to himself, over the next 2 to 3 years, we will make a series of strategic overtures, initially private and secret, over time more public, because there's a big prize at the end of the day.
Right.
He will only be commended for trying. Nobody will blame him if the whole thing collapses. It's a little bit like Middle East peace process. Nobody's going to blame you that the Israelis and the Palestinians don't make peace. That's been the story for 50 years. So why not try?
Rao, you want to?
Mr. Zakaria, President Trump is in the House right now, and huge excitement about him coming to Davos. The big question from India's perspective is, will Donald Trump help India and the people of India tackle the terrorism emanating from Pakistan that hurts our interests?
Well, Trump has been more tough on Pakistan than really anybody in rhetoric. The problem with Trump's rhetoric on Pakistan is, frankly, it's not thought through. Because the problem with Pakistan is that if you give them money, they support the jihadis. If you don't give them money, they support jihad. There hasn't been a clear correlation between withdrawal of support and them suddenly becoming better. And in fact, the US aid that was withdrawn is going to be made up by the Chinese in no time. So in a way, America will lose influence with Pakistan. And if China gains influence, you can be certain that they're not going to tell the Pakistanis to rein in these militants. So I think it wasn't very well thought through. I think that this kind of pressure is probably better asserted privately with Pakistan. But I think we come back to the point that Arun was making, which is that fundamentally you have to break this nexus. You have to find a way for Pakistan has to define its interests, its strategic interests, in more geo-economic terms than geopolitical ones. If you need a leader of Pakistan who says, my fundamental goal is to raise the per capita GDP of Pakistan, to raise living standards dramatically in one generation, in order to do that, I need peace and trade with India. If that becomes Pakistan's conception of its national interest. Right now, Pakistan's conception of its national interest still too often is things about strategic buffers and keeping Afghanistan somewhat unstable because it provides you with some kind of buffer zone. These are 19th century concepts. They really don't apply. There is no real danger that Pakistan's sovereignty is going to be assailed. What there is a danger is that Pakistan will stagnate and that these deeper forces of militancy and Islamic fundamentalism will take over. Look at what's happening in Bangladesh. You still don't have a Pakistani leadership that has the assertiveness, the will to say, this is our strategic interest. If you did, I think you'd see more happening. If I were in Prime Minister Modi's position, I would try to do everything I could to encourage that, and therefore not, don't embolden the hardliners on both sides.
You spoke about the Prime Minister needing to try. In fact, he tried in a more dramatic fashion than anybody else when he landed up in Lahore at drive-in at the then Pakistani Prime Minister's residence. We saw how that ended up with the Pathankot attack a week later. Over the last few years, we've seen China and Pakistan deepen their embrace. Do you see over the next few years Pakistan becoming an economic colony of China?
Well, there's no question that the Chinese have a strategy. And again, I say with the Chinese, it's very clear what their strategy is, and it is economic and military and strategic, and they all work together. So if you look at what they're doing in Burma, in Myanmar, with ports and with investment and with alliances with the government and with giving the government a carte blanche on the Rohingya issue. You look at what they're doing in Sri Lanka with ports and assistance. You look at what they're doing in Pakistan with ports and military assistance. It's exactly, it's all of a piece, and they are essentially encircling India. I think they had 15 border disputes with their neighbors. They have sorted out 14 of them. The only one that hasn't been sorted out is the Indian border. So, this is why I say I think India faces a reality that it can't escape. It can either look at that reality, in a kind of clear-eyed way and say we have to respond to it in some way and come up with our own strategic plan, our own 20-year plan that will respond to this.
What we have seen over the past few months are the first steps towards building a quad, where you've got Australia, you've got India, you've got Japan and the United States coming together in some kind of a unstated, loose strategic alliance against China. Do you believe India should press with the quad and look towards formalizing such an alliance?
I think India should be a very active member of those kind of initiatives. I think India has almost 2 or 3 games to play. One, it has to recognize this issue of its immediate environment, which is, the encirclement issue. That, frankly, Australia doesn't help you with. Australia is very far away. So you have to worry about that. Then there is the larger Asian balance of power. And then there is the issue of having global allies like the United States. And I think it almost is like playing 3-dimensional chess. You're going to have to be able to do all 3 to succeed in securing for India the kind of breathing space and interest that a country of its size will need, particularly over the next 20 or 30 years. India is growing slower than China, but because of demographics, India is going to have a larger and larger footprint in the world, and you need to make sure that that economic footprint is matched with political and geopolitical space that allows it to breathe.
When Prime Minister Modi started out in 2014, his first attempt was to try and broaden economic cooperation with China, like he did when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. We then saw incursions in Ladakh. Most recently, we've seen incursions in Doklam. Now there is a heavy Chinese build-up on the ground there. How does China perceive India under Prime Minister Modi, who's seeking to enhance India's stature? Because the BJP government is convinced that India is a world leader and China doesn't seem to like that.
The Chinese view of India economically is pretty. They don't take India that seriously economically. They do not regard it as a great threat. They don't regard it as a great challenge. Remember, this is the Chinese Communist Party. They regard it as a messy, chaotic democracy that can't get roads built, can't get infrastructure done, isn't investing in education nearly on the scale that China is. So the Chinese are busy trying to dominate artificial intelligence, and they're watching the Indians unable to produce enough steel and things like that. This may not be an accurate measure, but I think this is the way the Chinese look at it. But strategically, India has always been a thorn for China. I mean, back to 1962, when India had a very pro-Chinese policy, and still, there was always this sense that China has had, and that's partly because of the border, partly because of the sensitivity around Tibet. So I think that the Chinese have always been more tuned to the sense that there are fundamental incompatible interests between India and China. The Indians have always, ever since Nehru, either they don't pay any attention to China or kind of dreamily believe that somehow the Indians and Chinese will be great third world brothers.
Put aside the border dispute and continue to trade and do other normal relationships, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Chinese will do
maybe
business.
That's what we should be doing with Pakistan.
Absolutely, exactly. The Chinese do business.
Put the border dispute aside and let's start doing some economic integration.
I think this would be the single best path forward with Pakistan, which is to say, can we just agree that we both want to make our countries richer, and let us do everything we can to make Pakistani citizens richer, Indian citizens richer, and go along that track. And in a sense, as you know, the problem there is the Pakistani side doesn't want to do that as much. But that might be an argument that would also resonate in Pakistan, resonate with the Pakistani business community. Part of what one has to think about is how does one get Pakistani civil society on the side of engagement and normalization, rather than, because it's very easy to whip up the nationalist feelings. How do you counter those? And I think if India were to play a long game on that, that would be useful as well.
You live in America and you've seen, Indian governments change. Do you see a change in the Indian government's image from UPA to NDA with Modi in charge? Has there been a difference, or is it just more of the same, maybe a little more hyped?
No, I think that, look, with Manmohan Singh, you had somebody who was deeply respected. I mean, Obama, whenever he was asked who is the leader he respects in the world the most, almost always Manmohan Singh was in the top one or two people he would talk about. I think that the challenge was always, there wasn't a sense that Manmohan Singh had the power and the capacity to actually lead this large, unruly democracy. With Modi, there is this sense that he's a commanding figure in India, that he dominates Indian politics, that what he says will matter because he can get things done, which is all true. So I think, Modi is in a unique position where he is seen by the world as being able to deliver in a way that Manmohan Singh was not able to. And that gives him, Modi is has the potential to be seen as an Erdogan or a Putin. Now, I don't mean that in a negative sense. No. What I mean is just a figure who is so commanding that that he can lead his country where he wants to take it.
Finally, how was Prime Minister Modi's big splash at the World Economic Forum taken globally? To what extent do you believe this could accelerate the pace of foreign direct investment coming into India? A lot of competition now when it comes to attracting foreign investment. Do you believe Prime Minister's splash here has been a success?
I think Prime Minister Modi always comes across well. He comes across as somebody who is open to business, friendly for business. He says a lot of the right things, and a lot of the actions of the government have gone along with that. Some of them are smaller micro reforms, but it's all positive. The problem foreign investors have had in India is they have been seduced a couple of times before, and my experience, particularly with American investors, is they desperately want to believe in the India growth story. They love the idea, democracy, country where lots of people speak English, different from China, which they regard as a kind of weird, strange black box that they can't understand. But then they come to India, and they deal with the infrastructure, and they deal most importantly with the bureaucracy and the license quota permit Raj, which still exists, and the state-owned banks and the state-owned companies and the courts, which can tie you up even more than the bureaucracy can. And that then just you see the enthusiasm draining out. I can't tell you how many CEOs I know who 10 years ago made big pushes into India, and now they look and they notice that their China business is 5 times larger than their India business, and they have to put and growing faster, and they have to put more resources into China. So I think that ultimately the only way that changes is you have to change things on the ground, and you have to make it so that capital is welcome, not just with a red carpet at Davos, but so that it doesn't face varying and idiosyncratic and arbitrary tax issues, and the courts don't tie it up, and the local governments don't do things. Some of these things are issues of democracy, and those I think actually people understand. A lot of them are issues of corruption. People on the take from various. A lot of it is there's still a kind of anti-growth mentality in parts of the country, and those I think can be dealt with. It's maybe too much to ask Prime Minister Modi to solve all those points, but all those issues. But my point would be, a good speech at Davos will not change the mind of CEOs who have been trying to get stuff done in India for 10 years and haven't been able to.
Fareed Zakaria, it's always hugely thought-provoking chatting with you. We've got Prime Minister Netanyahu waiting for you, so we won't hold you back any longer. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for watching the video. For more such news and updates, please like, share and subscribe to India Today. Also check out our other great videos from our channel. We know you would love to.